Hello, welcome back to Rotary Rockets. Today we'll be making a new and improved parachute design. Now we already have a parachute making video on our channel. It shows an easy and inexpensive way to make a parachute out of parts that you can get at your local stores. And that's one of our most watched videos on our channel. So that tells me that there's a lot of people out there looking for ways to make parachutes. So in case you're interested in that design, I'll put a link down in the description. There'll also be a link on the screen at the end of this video if you want to take a look at that one afterwards. The parachute we're going to be building today is the same shape as the parachute we made in our previous video, but it uses completely different materials and a completely different construction type. This parachute is going to be both lighter and stronger than our previous design. Now this parachute design is something I came up with after I watched a couple of videos about how skydiving parachutes are made. I watched their construction technique and paid attention to the materials they were using, and then I tried to simplify that down into something that could be done easily at home. And this is what we came up with. So let's take a look at the materials. For the canopy, we're going to be using Ripstop Nylon fabric. Now this is probably not a material that you're going to be able to find at your local store. I had to purchase this online. There's plenty of places online that you can purchase it. Now the widest piece that I was able to find for this was about 62 inches wide. We trimmed down the edges and we're going to be making a 60-inch or 5-foot parachute. The next item we're going to use is paracord. Now this is a pretty standard size paracord. It's also sometimes called 550 paracord. Now 550 paracord has a 4mm diameter. Now paracord comes in a lot of different sizes. If you're going to build a larger parachute for a heavier load, you might want to go with a larger paracord. If you're going to build a smaller parachute, you could also scale this down to a much smaller size paracord as well. Now this particular construction method is going to require a lot of sewing, and specifically sewing with a sewing machine. So if you're not good with a sewing machine, you may want to find somebody that is. I'm not personally very good with a sewing machine, so I'm going to let my wife do all the sewing parts for me. So let's go build a parachute. Here I've got my piece of fabric laid out. This piece came 61 inches wide, and I purchased 2 yards, which is 6 feet. Now the edges of a piece of fabric are not usually very well finished. This one has a pretty bad frayed edge on both ends of it. So first thing I'm going to do is cut off about 1/2 inch down the length of the fabric on both sides just to clean that up. And then I'm going to cut a nice square piece of fabric out of this to start with. I've got my piece cut out. It ended up to be a final size of 60 inches by 60 inches. Now we've got a marker here, and we need to make a small mark at the center on all 4 sides. So my piece is 60 inches, so I'll just make a little mark with the marker at the 30-inch mark, and then I'll go around and repeat that on all 4 sides. Now before we go on to the next step, we need to do a quick math calculation. What you need to do is take the total width of your parachute fabric. For me, that's 60 inches. You can either use inches or millimeters here, it doesn't matter. Take that and divide it by 4.83. Now for me, the answer is 12.42. If I round that to the nearest 1/16 of an inch, that's about 12 7/16 of an inch. If you're using metric, just round to the nearest millimeter. Now whatever the answer is that you came up with for your parachute, write that number down. Now I'm going to start on this side here, and from that center mark that I made, I'm going to measure over to one side and make a mark at 12 7/16. You need to make a mark at whatever the answer was that you got for the equation that we just did. But for me, that was 12 7/16 of an inch. Now I'll make a mark right there. Then I go in the other direction from the center. Again, whatever the calculation was that you came up with, for me, I'm at 12 7/16 from the center. I'm going to repeat that on all 4 sides. Now that we've got all those marks done, we'll come down to one corner, and if we follow this up one edge, we find the first mark that we made here, And then going up in the other direction, we find the closest mark here. And we're just going to connect those 2 points with a straight edge and draw a line between the 2. And now we're just going to repeat that on all 4 corners. Now, before we go ahead and cut the corners off, now is a good time to check your measurements. If we check the distance here between this line here and this line here, this middle section, I've got a distance of 24 3/4 of an inch. And then if I check the lines that we drew, I'm also at 24 3/4 of an inch. Should go around, check all your sides and all your bevels to make sure that all your measurements are very similar. They might be off a millimeter here or a millimeter there, or even 1/8 of an inch plus or minus, but they should all be very, very similar. If they're not, then you either made a measurement wrong or you did the calculation earlier wrong. If they're off, remeasure them, remark them, and check it again. But we're ready to cut these out. Now I'm just going to follow that line and cut off the corner and repeat that on all 4 corners. And now we've got our octagon shape and we're ready to do some sewing. Now before we bring this in to start sewing, we need a length of paracord long enough to go around the entire outside of the parachute. So I'll go ahead and measure that off. And then I'll cut just a little bit extra long. We can cut that off later, but we definitely don't want it to be too short. Now we're not actually going to be using the entire paracord for this. We only want the outer sheath. So what you'll find is that this inner section actually pulls out very easily. So I'm going to take that entire inner section of the paracord out. The first thing we need to do is fold the corners up and sew those down. Now we want to fold it up about 3/4 of an inch. I did some quick math, and if we just measure up from the corner up one edge and make a little mark at the 4-inch point, and we'll do that on this other side here, 4 inches up, and make a little mark. Now we'll just connect those 2 dots together. We'll measure the distance between those 2, and we see we've got 7.5. So half of that is 3 3/4. We'll make a mark on the line right there. What that's going to give you is a distance from the point up to that mark of 1.5 inches. So when you fold this over and put the point right on that mark, you'll get a 3/4 inch fold. And then we'll use the sewing machine to stitch this down about 1/4 of an inch up right here. And then we'll go ahead and repeat that for all 8 corners. Next we're going to sew on the paracord that we took the center part out of. We'll start halfway between 2 of these corners right here, and we'll sew it on about 1/2 inch up from the edge. And when we get to the corners, we're going to stop sewing just before we get to this corner flap that we sewed over, and then we're going to start back sewing right after that corner flap. So there'll be an area right here where it's not sewed down. And we'll go all the way around the parachute until we meet back up with the beginning. Now we're going to take the edges of the parachute, roll them around the paracord, and stitch those down. And we'll do that all around the edge of the parachute so that the only section of paracord that's exposed are these little pieces at all 8 of the corners. The last portion of the stitching we're going to do is we're going to stitch at each corner, going up each side about 3 inches. We're going to stitch through the fabric and through the paracord again with a very tight zigzag stitch, and that'll be the reinforcing for that paracord to keep it from pulling out. We'll do that up each side at each corner. The last thing we need to make are the 8 shroud lines. And we're going to use the paracord for that. Now, as far as shroud line length, this is a flat fabric parachute. If you make the shroud lines too long, the parachute won't hold a parachute domed shape. It will tend to go flatter if your shroud lines are too long on this type of parachute because it's not a shaped fabric. So you want to keep the shroud lines a little bit short. And my general rule of thumb on this type of parachute is to make the shroud lines 1.25 times the width of the parachute. So this is a 60-inch wide parachute. If you multiply that by 1.25, you come up with 75 inches. So I want my shroud lines to be 75 inches. Now if you're going to tie them on, you need a little extra length on the end to account for the knot that you're going to make on both ends of the shroud line. I'm not going to tie these on. I'm actually going to do a loop system. We'll show that a little bit later, but I'm also going to need a few extra inches to do that system as well. So for me, my system is going to be extra 3 inches needed on each end. So 75 inches for the final length. I'm going to cut this 6 inches longer at 81 inches so I have some extra to work with. And now we need to look at attaching the shroud lines to the parachute. Now the simplest way to do this would simply be to tie it on with a knot. If you are going to use a knot, I would recommend looking up some type of a knot that's self-tightening so that when the shroud line pulls on that knot, it tries to tighten it up tighter rather than try to loosen it up or pull it apart. Now we're going to do something a little different. On skydiving parachutes, they don't use knots. And that makes sense because knots can be unreliable. They can loosen up, they can come apart. We're going to use a loop system. We're going to form a loop into our shroud line, and then later I'll show you how to attach that loop to the parachute. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the center core. Now on the end of the shroud line, I'm going to hold that end at 3 inches. I'm going to put a couple of marks on there. I'm going to make a little mark at 0. I'll make a mark at 3/4 of an inch and another mark at 1 3/4 inches. Okay, so here we have our 3 lines. This third line is going to be the top of our loop. So we'll wrap that around and there's that top mark. Then we're going to take this over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch a line of stitches between the first and second marks. And what we'll end up with is a little loop. Now we did a nice little zigzag stitch down there. We went down and then back up for 2 passes, so that's nice and strong. And then we repeated that on the other end, so we have the loops on both ends. Now the tail was left a little bit long, and that was really just so there would be something to hold on to while it was going through the sewing machine, so you could keep that aligned a little bit easier. But we don't need this really long tail on there. So we're just going to snip that down a little shorter, and then I'm going to protect the rest of this from the heat here and just hit the tip just a little bit with a torch. And just as that's cooling off, I just pinch it flat. And we'll end up with a nice finished edge like that. I'm going to repeat that on the other end, and then we're going to make 7 more shroud lines exactly like this. Now to attach this shroud line to the parachute, we're just going to put this under that cord there. We'll take the other end and put it through the loop and pull that cord all the way through. And there's our connection. Now the nice thing about this is it can't come apart, because the harder it pulls, the tighter that gets. So the only way for this corner to fail is if the actual cord breaks. So that's a really nice connection. We won't have to worry about that coming loose or coming apart. Now for the other end of the shroud lines, we need to bring these all to a central location. I like to use these little openable chain links. It has a little piece here that threads open, and then you can slide your shroud lines onto there. We'll get all 8 of the shroud lines on there, and then this can attach to the recovery cord, which attaches inside of the rocket. Now these shroud lines do end up to be a little bit bulky. If you have a limited amount of space in your rocket, this may be a problem to fit all these shroud lines in there. So I'm going to show you an alternative way to make your shroud lines with a smaller diameter paracord. Now paracord comes in a lot of different sizes. You see in this chart here, here's the 4mm diameter paracord that we've already used in this project. There's a couple of sizes larger than that and several sizes smaller than that. Now this paracord I've got here is about 2.4 millimeters in diameter. This is what I'll use to make my smaller shroud lines. You could really choose any paracord you want. It just depends on how strong you want the shroud lines to be. Now when it comes to attaching this to the parachute, there's a couple of different options. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I'll just give you some suggestions. First off, you could simply tie it on with a knot. Now if you are going to tie it on, I would recommend looking up a bowline knot. It's a good knot, and the reason I like the bowline knot is because it's self-tightening. So the harder the shroud line pulls, the tighter that knot will get, instead of trying to come apart. Now you could also choose to use this with or without the center core lines inside. If you leave the core lines inside, the cord is a lot stronger. But if you take those center lines out, you will find it's a little bit more flexible and a little bit easier to pack into the rocket. Now I'm going to do a design here that's going to give me a similar loop to what we did on the larger shroud lines, where I have a loop on the end of the cord. But because this is such a small diameter, you're going to find that this is not really feasible to put under the sewing machine and sew that down into a loop like we did on the other ones. So I'm going to do it a little bit differently. First off, I am going to take out the center core lines. And then I'll just hit the end here real quick, just to keep that end from fraying. Now this little tool here is called a fid. It's made for threading ropes and strings together. It basically just has this pointed end on here, and the other end has a little hole and it's threaded inside. So what I'm going to do to make the loop is come down and poke a hole through the cord. And then you can bring this other end and just thread it into that little hole just a little bit, and that allows you to pull that through the cord. And there we have our little loop. Now this isn't strong. If you pull on this, it just pulls that right back through the cord. So what you need to do is weave this back and forth through the cord several times, and what you'll end up with is something that looks like this. Here's the end, and it's been woven through several times, and we have the little loop on the end and that's extremely strong. Now I can attach this to the parachute exactly the same way that I attached the larger shroud lines to the parachute. Now this smaller diameter paracord that we're using isn't quite as strong as the larger 4mm paracord, but it does have a 275-pound load rating, so it is actually pretty strong for its size. Now, that said, we have taken out the center cores on this, so we have taken away quite a bit of the strength. So just to see how strong it is, we made this little jig here. I've got a little section of the small paracord here with the loops on it, just exactly the same as what we're going to be using on the parachute. And we did take the center cores out of this. That's attached to a chain that goes up to the trusses on the ceiling, and we've got this larger paracord here where I can put my foot in, and we're going to see if we can put my 200 pounds of weight on this and see if this little piece of paracord holds up. Alright, well that's my full 200 pounds of weight on that cord, and it's holding up fine. And then for one last test, we're going to put 2 people on here. That's going to be a total of about 400 pounds on this line. Woo! Okay. So, can handle 200 pounds of weight just fine. 400's a little over the limit. We had quite a lot of weight on there though before that broke, so it's pretty strong, and we're pretty confident that that's going to hold up just fine on the parachute. So I've got all 8 of those shroud lines built, and we've got them installed on the parachute and mounted down to this central mounting point. They came out really nice, and as you can see, using these smaller shroud lines is going to save a significant amount of space inside the rocket. So this will be the next parachute we're going to use on our next rocket launch. Don't forget to subscribe if you like what we're doing. Click that like button. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.